everyone, welcome to this video for PROG1198. This video's topic is CRUD operations, so let's get started. CRUD operations is an acronym for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. So our goal for this video is to modify the app that we created in the last video so that it can perform all four of these actions against the data in our database table. So before we start programming the actual code, we're going to take a minute to think about what kind of user interface elements we could use to facilitate this for the user. So the app that is the front face of this whole operation needs to have ways for the user to be able to indicate what action they want to take, to be able to enter or change their data, and to be able to submit their changes, which will then be pushed over to the database. So usually these are two-step operations where the user first is going to choose an action that they want to complete, and then they'll be given an opportunity to complete it and submit their changes. Now, before we get started looking through how to program all of this, I'm just going to bring up the solution file. Our starting point is going to be last week's solution file. So we have the solution that contains two projects. One is the library, and then the other is the UWP user interface. And before we get started, I just want to point out some changes that I made to the way that the user interface is organized. So I have added, as you can see here in the design view, a grid to the layout. Now we always have a grid. It's part of the default layout for the page. But I've modified the grid so that it contains this row and column tabular style structure. And the way that I've done that is by adding some column definitions and some row definitions into our grid in the XAML code. So the first change that I made was putting a margin all the way around the grid edges. So you can see that they're 100 pixels away from the edge of the page. These are all just design choices. You're not required to make a grid. You're not required to set the margins or columns and rows. You can lay out your page however you think it works best. I just wanted to show this example as one way that you can organize the page when there's a lot going on it. So I've defined 4 columns and 3 rows. And each column definition has been given a width. So you can see how column 1 has a width of 150. That's this column here. And then column 2 is this one, column 3 at 250, and then column 4 at 600. Now the widths don't have to add up because resizing the size of the app will affect that. It just gives you something to work with. And the row definitions are similar. So the top 2 rows are defined as being a height of 50 pixels, and then the third row here is a height of 250. So you can see 250 is this blue bar, but it will continue down to the bottom of the page to account for that 100 pixel margin at the bottom. So this is just one way of organizing some things. So you can see I've taken our 3 controls that we created last time, the input text box, the search button, and the output label. And I've put each one of those in the first row, and this one here is in the first column, and then second column, third column. So the way that we do that is by adding these grid.row and grid.column attributes to our XAML tags. So our text box txt department code is in row 0, column 0. So that puts it right up here into this first cell. And the button is in row 0, column 1. So this is how you can organize your pieces and put them into a various row or column. Now another thing that you can do with grid rows and columns is to create a span. So if we want to put something down here, say in this box, but you want it to be wider and take up 2 or 3 columns, we can do that by adding a column span, or if you want to go via rows, we can add a row span that allows the rows to merge together. And I'm going to be showing you how to do that a little bit later in this video. So now that we have that user interface base out of the way, let's continue with our idea about performing CRUD operations. So we're going to start with reading. Reading's a little bit easier because there's only one step involved. With changing things, there's always two steps, but with reading, there's just the one step. When our page is first loading up or displayed on the screen, we want to be able to show a list of all of the objects. So that's going to be our starting point. When it first starts, we're going to see a list of all of the departments. Now, last time, we were able to read and display data from our database table by finding one object. So we did that project last time where we found one object given a matching primary key value. So this time we're going to start by finding a list of all objects. Now, in a later video coming up next week or perhaps the week after, we're going to write more complicated read actions that are used to filter the data returned from the database based on some user selections. But for now, we're just going to find a list of all of the departments that we have in our department table. So how could we display a list of objects in our app? One of the easiest ways to do it is by using a view type user control. So if we have a view, like a grid view or a list view, we can use a list as our data source. This allows us to automatically generate one row in the list view for every element in the list. So we're going to focus on list view for now. There are other view type of controls, and please feel free to explore those if you want to find out more about them. So our goal here is very similar to what we were doing last time, where we have the business layer and the user interface, and they work together. So our 4 steps in order to accomplish this are as follows. We're going to write a method in the data layer, which is going to retrieve for us a list of all of the departments. Then we're going to call that method from our UWP app when we want to retrieve the list. Third, we're going to assign that list as the data source for our list view. And finally, we're going to customize the list view so that it can display the various elements via the binding. So we'll talk a bit in a few minutes about binding and how that works. Let's start in the data layer. So in our company repository, last time we wrote a method that went to the database to get one department given a department code. And the return type here is department because it was returning one single object. This time, we're going to write a method that returns a list of departments so that we can have a whole collection of all of them. Now, in SQL Server, the SQL statement that we would write would be something like select all from department. Or we can be more specific and select specific fields, or we can perform a join if we want to select information from multiple tables. So there's a lot of flexibility here with what we want to include or exclude to or from our data set. But in order to keep it simple, this time we are just going to write a SQL statement that selects everything from the department table. So we're going to start by writing our method that returns a list of department objects called getAllDepartments. And we know that we're going to have to return a list. So once again, I'm going to define the SQL statement that we need. Select star from department. And my next step is to use a Dapper method to send that query to the database. So we're going to call db.query again. So we use query to execute a query. That's pretty straightforward. It comes from the extension, the Dapper extension. It's the same bit of code. So we're going to call db.query, and we're going to send our SQL. And now in this example, you can see that we have a second parameter that passes the value for dep code in our query. But here, because our query doesn't have any input parameters, we don't need that second value. Now, also in the previous example, we returned a single or a default value. So that means, if there were multiple departments matching this, it would only return one. In this case, we don't want to only return one. What we want to return is a list. So we're going to call toList instead. So the thing that comes back is going to be a list of type T. The department is the type T here, so we're having a list of department objects. And then after that, we're going to return the list. Now, the only thing missing was that I forgot to specify the data type of the objects. You can see how when I called query, it's a generic. We have to specify the data type. So we're going to put this here as well. So what the query does is it executes that SQL statement, select all from department. It interprets them with this department data type, stores them in a list, and then we return that list. Now, on the slides, you'll see that I did it all in one line. So I put the return statement, and I just typed the SQL statement right in there instead of using a variable. So this is a little bit more efficient because we're not storing things that we don't need. But I'm going to leave the longer version in here just so that it more closely resembles the previous example. So step one is done. We were able to call a method that gives us a list of departments. So now from the UI side, we're going to need to call on this method. And when we get that list, we're going to use that list to fill a list view object. So in order to do that, we're going to need to actually create the list view on the page first. So I want to put the list view down here in this area. But because it's going to be rather large, I'm going to put it here in, this is row 2. The numbering starts at 0, so this is row 2 here. But I want it to take up the space of all 3 of these columns. So I'm going to grab a list view and put it into the code here. And you can see that when you drag and drop a list view into the code, it just creates this blank or empty tag. If you put a list view actually into the user interface, it recognizes what row I put it in. So either way, if you want to code it or if you want to drag and drop it. Now, it put it in row 2, but it didn't assign it any column. So I'm going to assign it to begin in column 0. But I also want to specify that it takes up 3 columns worth of space. So technically it's going to be in columns 0, 1, and 2. But we can't assign more than one value here. So I add another property here called column span. And I say that it's going to span over 3 columns. And we can see now, you might have noticed that it jumped over and the list view now is taking up the width of all 3 columns. One other thing to consider is that it's created the list view as one single tag, but we want to be able to put elements inside the list view. So I'm going to modify the tag so that it doesn't end here. So I'm going to remove this /, and then I'm going to add a closing tag so that list view can add as a container, can act as a container, similar to how grid and page are. So we have the opening tag for list view and then the closing tag here, and we'll be able to put things inside it. Now, when we're working with list views, it's similar to what we had to do with the grid. So in the grid, I had to define what my columns and rows are going to be. In a list view, we have to define what's called the item template. So we specify, once we assign items to be showing in the list view, we have to specify how those items are going to look and how they're going to be organized and where everything is going to be. So we create within the list view an item template. So we have list view.item template, and this is a container as well. Now inside the item template, we're going to define a data template. So the data template indicates how we display the data that is bound to the list view. So when I say bound, in the future, we're going to assign that list of departments as the items source for this list view. And each element in that list is going to be set up and displayed according to the data template. So we need all these pieces to work together. Now inside the data template, we can only put one element in here. So if we can only put one element in here, but we want to show a whole bunch of things about the department, you know, we want to show the name, we want to show the department code, we want to show the budget. I want to use text blocks to display all of those values. So I'm going to put a text block here, but you'll see if I try to put a second text block here, I start getting an error message because we can only have one thing in the data template. So before we start programming all the text blocks to show the various pieces of the data, I need to group them together in some kind of container. I know we're getting kind of deep into the tree here. Now, if you're only showing one thing in the list view, that's kind of the default action. If you have a list view, you can show a list, you know, you've seen this before where you show like a list of strings or something. And so if you only need one text block, then you don't have to worry about the next step. But when I want to show more than one thing, I can only have one element in the data template. So I'm going to cheat and put in an element that can act as a container for others. A relative panel. So a relative panel is a container, and I can put the text blocks inside of there. So it's kind of a little bit of cheating the system. So now we're all set up to show multiple things inside the data template. A relative panel organizes the elements in relation to each other. So with the text blocks, we're going to have to be careful that we put margins on these things. Otherwise, they're both going to be right on top of each other. There are other types of panels that you can use, like a stack panel, for example. If you use stack panel, the things end up one on top of each other. I mean above and below. You can kind of see it in the picture how a stack panel is organized. But with a relative panel, everything just appears in the exact same place, like overlapping, unless you specify otherwise. Okay, so in our relative panel, I've got two text blocks. One of them is going to show the department code, and the other one is going to show the department name. Now, if you want to practice and put in the department budget too, you can definitely do that. So my text block is going to have a text property, and we'll worry about binding it later. And we're going to set the margin so that this one appears 50 pixels away from the left. And then the next one, I'm going to set it to appear 100 pixels away from the left so that they're not right on top of each other. Now you might notice that when I'm working inside the data template of the list view, all of these changes I'm making are not showing up because there's no data to display inside this list view. It's the same as if you have a text block but it doesn't have any text, right? When it's empty, you can see it doesn't show up at all. So it's a little tough, it's a little tough, you know, to work on elements that you can't see. So my suggestion would be to build this thing, excuse me, using, you know, if you want to just see how it looks without having to deal with all of the testing, you can build it with a preset list of items. So if you go into the list views property and you can use the dialog box to just preset a bunch of dummy items, and then you will be able to test it and see how it looks. And then from there you can change it later, remove those items, and bind it to the data from the database instead. So that is how we can set up. Now we have two text blocks that don't have any text in them. If I put in some text, you'll see that I still can't see anything in my list view because my list view doesn't have any items bound to it. So this isn't going to help us design. The only way that you can help design is by assigning some items to that list view. Now, there are other things you can do with list views. For example, you can create a header template if you want to put a header row on the top of your list view, or you can create footers. There's lots of other ways that you can organize the list view. Instead of using a relative panel, you can put a grid in here with rows and columns and create a little like table of the elements. So you can definitely be as creative as you want within the data template. Now the last and most important part of the list view is we need to make sure that we give it a name. So we're going to assign the list view a name so we can access it in code. The prefix is LVW. And I'm going to call it LVW departments. It's a list view that shows all the departments. All right, now that we have a place to put it, we can move on to calling that method that we wrote. So we have our method that gets all the departments. We now have a place to put the departments, and we need to put them together. So we want the departments to appear when the page loads. So in the main page constructor, we have to make sure that we do it after all the components are initialized. If you try to do it before, then the list view won't exist yet. But after the fact, we can put in a line of code that will call that method. So once our database exists, I can get a list of departments by using our database connection to call that method that we wrote, get all departments. And once I have the list, I can use it as the item source for the list view. And that's all there is to it. So now our departments are acting as the item source for the list view. Now the final piece of the puzzle involves telling the list view how to display the various pieces of the department object. So my list view now knows that it's bound to a list of departments, and we know what a department is because we defined department as having these three properties, dep code, dep name, and dep budget. So we can use in the text block a reference to the binding. And from there, the binding data type is department. So we can go into department and get the dep code property. So we're going to get the department code from the binding, and we're going to place it as the text property of this text block. And we're going to do something similar with department name. Well, there's nothing left to do now but test it and make sure that it works. So let's run the project and we'll make sure that we can see all of the departments. So now my app has loaded. You can see my list view is here, and the list view has these two text blocks inside it. You can see there's the padding, the 50 pixels that I put on the left margin of the department code. So we have this nice list generated with two text blocks in it, and each element in the list view is one department object. And once we have a list view of department objects, we have choices as to how we want to use this. Is it just for viewing, or do we want the user to be able to interact with it? So if we consider where we're going with this app and the things that we want to be able to do, one of the things that we want to be able to do is edit an existing department. And we could use the list view to select a department for editing. So if I say were to click on one of these and select it, it could have the effect of opening up some additional form that allows me to modify and submit the data for that selected department. Or we could have a situation where maybe we want to put a button in this list. So if we wanted to try to delete a department, we could put a delete button over here and allow a user to click on that. And the delete button that was clicked, there would be 4 buttons in this case, but each one would be uniquely tied to this department code. So you can find out which button you clicked on and delete the associated department that way. So now that we have this list view, we can create elements inside it to interact with, or we could create events that happen when you click on an element. If you wanted to, you could program this thing however you want. Now for the next steps in the CRUD operations, so we've done the read, we need to think about how we're going to create, update, and delete. Now create and update share something similar in that we need to have a way for the user to enter all of the fields or data about a new department or updating a department. So I'm going to use the same fields for both actions, and then just have some way in my program that keeps track of whether we're updating something that exists or trying to generate something new. Delete is a little bit different because we don't need to enter any information. All we need to know is the department code of the department that we want to delete. So even though the slides that I posted talk about add and update next, what I'm going to do is move forward to delete operations. And we'll look at those first because they're a little bit more simple. And then in the next video, I'm going to cover create and update. Now, one of the ways that we could offer a delete option is by selecting a department, going into edit mode, and then instead of having an update button, you can also have a delete button. But in this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a delete button directly into the list view because it will allow the user to save a step. You won't have to select a department and then click delete. You'll be able to click a delete button right next to the department name and have the department disappear right away. So I'm going to create 2 different actions with the same list view. So we're going to have a button over here in this area. And if you click the button, that takes a different action than if you click somewhere else on the department. So if you click on the department code or name, you can see how it's becoming selected by getting highlighted in the green color here. But when we click the button, we want that action to be different. So we're going to put a button into the list view. Let's take a look at our list view solution. I want the button to be right in front of the department code text block. So I'm going to add the button into this area. Just drag and drop the button right there. We're going to create a click event on that button, but we have to also remember to specify something unique about that button that relates to the binding. So when I create a button, we want to make sure that we give it a name so that we can interact with it. The name of the button btn delete. And we're going to create a click event on this button. And I also need the button to say something. And again, we can't see it being generated because we're inside the list view and the list view doesn't have any items. So if you wanted to, you could set the button up somewhere else on the page, program all of its things, and then just move it into the relative panel after. But we're pretty familiar with how buttons work now, so we know that we need to set content, and that's what the button is going to say on it. You could also make the button an image. It doesn't have to be an actual button object. You can put an image there if you want to have an image of a nice like trash can or an X to delete something. It doesn't have to be a button. This is just a demonstration of an option for you. So the content for my button, I'm going to use an X to indicate that when you click on this, it's a delete button. And we are going to make a click event on this button. Now, typically the way we make a click event is actually by double-clicking it in the design view. But there are other ways to create it. For example, you can just start typing click, and you can use the pop-up option to create a new event handler. Another option is you can go into the properties window, click on the lightning bolt to get to events, find click, and then double-click in there. Either way, we get this event handler that happens when you click on that delete button. Now, the problem is, though, is that you're going to end up with 4 identical X delete buttons. And the reason for that is because there's 4 departments, and all of them are exactly the same. Same name, same content, same click event. So we would need some way of indicating which of the 4 buttons you chose. Right now, they're all completely identical. Now, if you click on one delete button, you don't want to delete all of the departments. We need to catch the department code of the button that you clicked. Now, one way that you could choose to do it is to put the department code in the content, and then each button would say a different thing, and you could, on the button click event, find out what is the content of the button that you clicked. If we remember how click events work, the first input parameter, sender, gives us access to the object that caused this event. So if all 4 of the buttons go to the same place, we can go to the sender and find out which button it was. But that means that each button needs to have some kind of unique content. Now, I don't want the buttons to say the department codes on them. I want them all to say X. But we can use another property called tag, which is allowing us a way to put an individual piece of data into a button kind of behind the scenes. If you're familiar with HTML coding, it's kind of like putting a hidden input. So in the tag, I'm going to put in the binding department code. It won't show it on the screen, but it will put the department code as the value of this tag property. So that when this button is clicked in the click event, we're going to retrieve the tag of the clicked button. So sender is the button that causes the event, and we want to find out what that button's tag is. Now, as you can see, sender comes in as a generic object. So our first step is going to be to specify that the sender is actually a data type button. So I'm going to use a typecast to get a reference to the button that is the sender. And then from there, I can get the button's tag. But again, tag comes in as an object. We need it as a string. So if I try to go to the button's tag property, you can see that it's just an object. So we want to specify, no, this thing is a string. It's a string on a button. Now, once we've got it, I'm just going to use a message dialog to indicate that we are successfully able to display that. So I'm going to create a message dialog. And we'll say the message shown is something like, you have clicked the name of that button. Oops. Now, in order to use message dialog, I just need to add that reference the using statement. You can use the little light bulb helper here, or you can just type it at the top to get that reference. You can see it added it right up there. So this is just a test before we move on to make sure that I'm retrieving the correct department code from that delete button. So let's run it and we'll give it a try. So the app has loaded. You can see my X buttons now. There's one X button next to each department. And if I click on one of the X buttons, you can see that it retrieves the tag, which was bound to the department code, and it knows which one I've clicked. So now that we are able to retrieve a department code from a delete button, our next step would be we want to tell the database to delete department with this code. We know the department code. We need to call some kind of delete method. So anytime we want to interact with the database, those are changes that we need to make in our library. So I'm going to go back to my repository database file where we make all of the SQL queries, and I'm going to write one that performs a delete action. Now we don't need it to return anything, so I'm going to write it as void. And we have a method that will delete a department. Now we need to specify which department we're deleting, just like in the previous example where we had to specify which department we were selecting. So we need that parameter, department code, so that we can use it in our SQL statement. Our SQL statement for deleting one single department, delete from department where department code equals some input parameter. And our next step is to execute this query. Now in the previous examples, I have used this db.query method, which executes a query and returns the data type. Now in this case, I'm not returning anything. It's not a select query, so I don't have anything coming back to capture. So I'm not going to use db.query. What I'm going to use instead is a different method called db.execute. We're going to specify the SQL statement that we need. So the first parameter is the SQL statement. The second parameter is any input parameters we need. So just like this previous example where we said, yeah, there's one input parameter called department code, we have the same thing here. We have one input parameter that is stored in our department code variable. Now, what execute does return is an integer, the number of rows affected. So in the future, one thing that we could do is to assign that integer that is returned to a variable, test it to make sure that it's greater than 0. So we can make sure that, yes, the delete actually did succeed. We can have this method return that integer, or we could have it return like a Boolean, true if it succeeded, false if not. So there's lots of different additional things that we could potentially add on later to make this thing more robust. Because right now, if we try to delete a department that the department code doesn't exist, the execute command will just throw an exception for you if there's an error. If there's not an actual error, like if you try to delete something and that thing doesn't exist, that's not an SQL error. So we would want to test the results to see if anything was deleted and throw an error if it wasn't. But for now, we're just going to leave it as is. So we have this method that we can call to delete a department. If we pass a department code, that department will try at least to be deleted. Now we know that some of the departments can't be deleted because they're connected to employees. Referential integrity rules say that we can't delete a department when employees reference it. So we'll be able to see how we can handle some errors like that. Okay, so all of the steps are set up. We just have to connect the method that we wrote here to the code that we were writing for the button click for the delete button. So we want to tell the database to delete the department with that department code. And again, it's just like how we did it before. We use our database object and call on the method. We have to pass the department code. Remember, the department code is stored in this variable called tag. So we're going to pass that variable over there. Now, one thing to consider, deleting the department from the database table does not delete it from the list view. The list view only gets updated when we assign it its item source. Now, because we're using a standard list as the item source, the list view has no way of knowing when the list changes. There's no event raised for that. Now, in the future, you might want to consider, instead of using a list, use something called an observable collection, because observable collections do raise events when the collection changes. And then you can program those events to refresh your list view. But it's a little bit more complex than what we're getting into. We want to focus more on the interactions between the database and the UI. So I'm not going to use observable collections in this course, but I did want to mention it because now we have a problem to solve where we need to refresh the list view to reflect the fact that that department is actually gone. Now, in order to do that, what we need to do is to remake our list of departments. That means go back to the database, retrieve the current updated list of departments, and then assign that new list to the list view. Now we already have 2 lines of code up here that do that. So this one gets the list of departments from the table, and then this one assigns it to the list view. So we have those 2 lines of code. We can rewrite those 2 lines of code again in the delete button. But looking ahead, we're going to have to do this again when we perform an insert. We're going to have to do this again when we perform an update. So it's something that has to keep happening. And so I'm going to encapsulate it in a method that we can call so that I don't have to keep writing the same lines of code over and over. So I'm going to create, and I'm going to put it right up near the top here so that it's noticeable, a method that we can call that loads the data. And all it's going to do is those 2 lines of code. So get an updated list of departments from the table and assign this list to the list view. So rather than write these 2 lines of code here, I'm going to perform a call to my load data method. And also down here, when we have deleted something, I'm going to perform a call to my load data method. And later on, when we work on inserts and updates, we're going to have to reload the data then as well. So let's test out our delete button now and make sure that we are able to delete departments. So I'm going to try first deleting a department that we know will not be able to be deleted. The accounting department has employees attached to it. So if I try to delete the accounting department, you can see that I'm getting an error message. Now this isn't the most useful error message, so I'm going to select my common language runtime exceptions and start my project over again so that I can see a more useful error message appear when I try to delete accounting. You can see that the error message that's thrown, for starters, where is it coming from? It's coming from that Dapper library. You see that when it pops up. I can't move my mouse to point to it, but towards the end of this ridiculous long thing, you see that it comes from Dapper. And it ultimately comes from the SQL client, which is, it's coming from SQL Server. And the SQL Server error message says the delete statement conflicted with the reference constraint. So this is our referential integrity problem. So when we execute this query, it throws an exception if I'm unable to delete that department because of a referential integrity error. This is something that we need to consider planning for when we delete. We can put this in a try block, and if it happens to throw an exception, then we can write some code to pass that exception on to the user interface so that we can show the user a message about what went wrong. Now, let's restart and delete a department that actually can be deleted so we can prove that our code does work. So we have the personnel department. I don't believe any employees are tied to it. So if I click the personnel department, you can see that it just disappeared. So personnel department's gone, but I won't be able to delete any of the other ones because they all have employees. So this brings up two concerns. The first is that management of potential errors. The second is that I was very easily able to delete something that is irretrievable. I can't undo and get that department back. So one of the things we might want to consider doing is providing a confirmation. And I'm sure you've experienced this before, that you've had a, are you sure you want to delete this? And you have to select yes or agree or something like that. Before you undertake an action that is irreversible, it asks you, are you sure? So we're going to take a little minor detour and use this message dialog to ask the user, are you sure? And we have to get a way to capture their response. Now, by default, a message dialog just has that one button on it. So the button that comes up when you see a message dialog, oh, we won't be able to see it now, but there's just one button that allows you to close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my message dialog. First, I'm going to modify the message that instead of just telling you, oh, you clicked this, it's going to say, are you sure you want to delete this? And we'll make it a question. So when we ask them a question, there are two possible outcomes, yes or no. So I'm going to add those two commands, user interface buttons for yes and no. So my message dialog commands is a collection. It's a list actually. And we're going to add a new button that says yes. And then we're going to add a new button that says no. And now, instead of just showing the message, we want to capture the result of that message. Now, without getting too deep into things like threading and things like that, the way that the message box works by default when we write it the way that we have been writing it all this time is that the message box comes up and then the app is still doing its own thing and they're kind of independent of each other. You are free to ignore the message box. We don't want this one to be ignorable. We want to wait and see what the user chooses. And then we want to capture that result and store it so we can evaluate it and find out what they pressed, yes or no. So there's a few changes that we make. The first is that we're going to add an await command. If you've ever noticed this about a message box, it says awaitable, and you always see this green underline. because it says it's not awaited. Finally, we're going to employ await here. In order to employ await in a method, the method has to be defined as async. But now we can wait for this dialog box and capture its result. Now, its result is one of these UI command objects. So I'm just going to use the interface IUI command because we don't know what type of object it is and we don't care. But what it is the result from the message box. So after the message box closes, the result, the selected UI command, either the yes button or the no button, is going to be stored into this variable. And then we can use that variable to find out whether we clicked yes or no. So we go into the button and see if its label said yes. So if it's a yes, then we want to do these things. So I'm going to put my brackets around those. And if it's a no, then nothing happens. So this will be a nice way for the user to confirm. That way if you click on an X button accidentally, or you click on the wrong X button accidentally, it just gives you a moment's pause before instantly deleting it from the database. Now, in order to demonstrate this and prove that the deletes still work, I'm going to need to add some new departments. So I'm just going to pause the video while I refresh my department database. So I've got my department inserted and refreshed here. I have all 4 of the department codes again. I'm just going to insert a few more for testing purposes. So I've added a few more departments, and this will show how our list view can grow, and it will also give me some things that I can actually delete. Now I'm going to run my project again, and we'll test out our new and improved delete command. So now you can see my list view. It has extended beyond the borders that I have defined for this 600 pixel high row in my grid. So you can see how the list view will automatically give you a scroll bar that you can scroll up and down, which is really handy. And we have all these departments here. So when I click on an X button, I get the confirmation message here. You'll see that I can't go away and ignore it. So my options here are I can choose yes or no. Now if I choose no, nothing happens. The department stays here. Just go back. But if I choose yes, then the department is now deleted. So I've deleted my test 1 department. Now the other problem that we have to solve, of course, is if we try to delete departments that cannot be deleted, we still get this exception. So that's going to be our next step. So we're going to be looking at error handling a little bit later. Once we get our insert and update done, then we'll talk more about dealing with errors when we're doing action queries. In the next video, we're going to complete the lesson on CRUD operations by looking at how we can perform inserts and updates via our user interface. So I will see you next time.